Go now, Evelina whispered. The carriage lurched forward into the dark, and she pressed herself flat against the seat, barely breathing. She had not packed everything. She had not even packed enough. Her only possessions were one trunk, a small pouch of coins, and the wedding ring she had already pulled off her finger and left on the windowsill like a quiet verdict. That was all she had taken from 3 years of being the Duchess of Dunor. The horses were moving fast, too fast for the narrow lane behind the estate. Evelina had told the driver not to slow down for anything, and she had pressed 3 gold coins into his palm to make sure he understood her urgency. She twisted around and looked through the small rear window. Dunor Hall was still lit. Every window was blazing, and even from this distance, through the fog and the dark, she could see the front doors had been thrown open. Figures were spilling out onto the steps. Her stomach dropped. They had noticed already. She turned back and gripped the seat with both hands as the carriage hit a rough patch of road and jolted violently. Her hairpins scattered, and her cloak slipped from one shoulder. She did not stop to fix either because, somewhere behind her, a horse whinnied sharply. Then came the sound of hooves, hard, fast, and getting louder. He was coming after her. Alistair Dunor, the most powerful duke in 3 counties, the man who had quietly replaced her with his pregnant mistress, Clara Vane, without a single word of apology, was now riding through the night to drag her back. In that moment, Evelina made a decision. With her jaw set, her eyes dry, and her hands gripping the seat so hard her knuckles ached, she vowed she wouldn't go back. Not tonight, not ever. Faster, she called through the small hatch to the driver. Please, faster. The carriage surged forward and swallowed itself into the darkness. Now, before we go any further, consider this. Evelina left that ring on the windowsill and ran into the night with almost nothing. Do you think she was being brave, or do you think she was being broken? If this opening has your pulse running, stay tuned, because what Duke Alistair does when he realizes she's truly gone will turn this entire story upside down. The carriage rattled hard over the old stone bridge, and Evelina finally allowed herself to exhale. She had made it past the Dunor estate boundary. She could tell, by the way, the road changed beneath the wheels, smoother now, cutting through open farmland instead of the manicured gravel paths that lined the Duke's property. The torches from the main house were no longer visible through the rear window. The sound of hooves behind her had faded somewhere around the bend past the miller's cottage. She was out for now. She loosened her grip on the seat edge and flexed her fingers slowly. The skin across her knuckles was red and stiff from holding on so tightly during those first desperate miles. Her hair had come completely undone at some point during the rough stretch of road near the old oak grove. As dark strands fell loose across her face and neck, she pushed them back with one hand and tried to think clearly. She needed a plan, a real one. Not the frantic blur of motion that had carried her from her dressing room to this carriage in under 20 minutes, but something solid. Something that could hold her weight once the shock of leaving began to wear off. She had coins, not as many as she would have liked, but enough to buy passage further north if she was careful. She had the small brooch her mother had left her, tucked deep inside the lining of her trunk, where no one would think to look. That could be sold if things grew desperate. She had a name she could use, her maiden name, Evelina Ashton. It was plain and unremarkable, belonging to a family that had no great standing, and therefore attracted no great attention. That was useful now in a way it had never been during her years as a duchess. The carriage slowed slightly as the driver navigated a sharp turn, and Evelina braced herself against the side panel. Through the small window, she could see the first pale suggestion of dawn beginning to color the horizon, the gray softening into the faintest wash of gold at the very edge of the sky. She had been moving for nearly 2 hours then, 2 hours since she had walked out of Dunor Hall without looking back. She thought about looking back now, not literally, but in the way the mind will drag a person backwards even when the body is moving forward. She thought about the morning 3 days ago, when she had walked into the east parlour and found Alistair's personal secretary, a thin, nervous man named Mr. Gable, frantically clearing papers from the writing desk with the look of someone who had been caught doing something they shouldn't. She had thought nothing of it then. Mr. Gable was always anxious about something, but then she saw the letter. Not all of it, just a corner poking out from beneath the stack Mr. Gable was gathering, just enough to see a name written in Alistair's own hand, Miss Clara Vane. Beneath the name was a single line that she had read in less than a second, and spent the following 3 days trying to unread. The child must be provided for, and so must she. Evelina had not confronted him. That was what surprised people who knew her well, or rather, what would have surprised them if any of them had been close enough to know anything real about her life inside Dunor Hall. Everyone assumed the Duchess of Dunor was quietly content. She played the role so perfectly that even the servants believed it. But she had learned very early in her marriage that confronting Alistair Dunor about anything he had already decided did nothing except make her look weak and him look inconvenienced. So she had not said a word. She had smiled through dinner that evening. She had listened to him talk about the new drainage project on the North Field and the letter he had received from his solicitor in London. She had poured his wine, answered when spoken to, and retired at the usual hour. Then she spent the next 2 days making quiet, careful preparations to leave. She had sent a note to Gideon Briggs, the younger of the 2 estate drivers, a man who had worked for her father before Alistair poached him, and who still, she believed, held some small loyalty to her. She had asked him to have a carriage ready at the rear gate before 4 in the morning on Thursday. She had not told him why. He had not asked. She had gathered what she needed in small amounts over 2 days, so that nothing looked unusual. A few dresses folded away, her mother's brooch retrieved from the jewelry box, and coins she had been quietly accumulating from household accounts for months. It wasn't stealing exactly. She had always thought of it as keeping something safe, a small reserve that was hers alone in a life where almost nothing was. The morning she left, she had stood in the centre of her dressing room for a long moment, looking at the room around her, the cream walls, the tall mirror with the gilded frame that had been a wedding gift from Alistair's aunt, and the writing desk where she had composed hundreds of polite letters to people she barely knew on behalf of a life she had not entirely chosen. She had taken none of it. Just her trunk, her coat, the pouch of coins, and the knowledge that if she didn't leave that morning, she might never find the courage again. She had slipped out through the servants' corridor, which connected to the rear courtyard, without passing through any of the main rooms. Gideon had been waiting exactly as she had asked, the carriage already turned and ready, his face carefully blank, in the way of a man who understands that some things are better not witnessed too closely. She had climbed in, and he had driven, and that had been that. Now 2 hours later, with dawn beginning to properly break across the countryside, Evelina sat in the jolting carriage, and tried very hard not to think about the moment the household would discover her gone. Mrs. Holton, the housekeeper, would notice first. The woman noticed everything. She would go to Evelina's rooms to deliver the morning tea, and find the bed unslept in, and the wedding ring sitting on the window-sill, and she would know instantly that this was not a simple absence. Evelina had left the ring on purpose, not as cruelty, but as clarity. She wanted there to be no confusion about whether she had simply gone for an early walk or driven to the village for some errand. She wanted them to understand immediately and completely that she had made a choice. What she had not been able to predict was how quickly that understanding would reach Alistair himself. She found out less than an hour later that the carriage had just passed through the small market town of Brethwick, rattling over the cobblestones of the main street, while the first traders of the morning were setting out their stalls, when Gideon suddenly called down through the hatch in a voice that was trying very hard to stay calm. "My lady, there is a rider behind us." Evelina's spine went rigid. "How far?" "Half a mile, maybe less, moving fast." She twisted around and pressed her face close to the rear window. The morning light was thin but growing, and she could see the road stretching back through the town. And there, yes, coming hard around the far bend, was a single rider on a dark horse, moving at a pace that had nothing casual about it. She could not see his face from this distance, but she knew the way he rode, as she had watched Alistair Dunor ride 100 times across the fields of his estate, and she knew the particular set of his shoulders when he was determined about something. "Do not stop," she said through the hatch. "Whatever happens, Gideon, do not stop this carriage." "Yes, my lady." The horses surged forward. Evelina gripped the seat again and watched through the rear window as the rider gained ground with alarming speed. Alistair rode the way he did everything else, with complete and total commitment, as though the possibility of failure had simply never occurred to him as a real option. The gap between them was closing. She looked away from the window and pressed her back against the seat and made herself breathe slowly. She thought about Clara Vane. She thought about the line in that letter, as she thought about 3 years of dinners and duties, and a marriage that had always felt slightly too large for her, like a coat made for someone with broader shoulders, and she held all of that in her chest like ballast, and used it to keep herself very, very still. The rider was close enough now that she could hear the hooves even over the noise of her own carriage wheels. And then, just as her heart was climbing into her throat, Gideon took a sharp left turn onto a narrow farm track that cut between 2 fields of early wheat. The carriage lurched violently, tilted for one horrible second as though it might tip entirely, and then righted itself and kept moving, now on a rougher surface, but hidden from the main road by a dense hedgerow running along the left side of the track. Evelina held her breath. She heard the hooves on the main road, fast, getting closer, then passing, then slowly fading. She let the breath out. Gideon brought the carriage to a careful stop after another 10 minutes. The carriage pulled into the yard of a farmhouse, where a stout woman in a grey apron was already moving between her outbuildings with a basket of feed. The woman looked at the carriage with mild surprise and no particular alarm, the way country people look at unexpected things when they have seen enough of life to know that unexpected things are rarely as dramatic as they first appear. Evelina climbed out stiffly. Her legs were unsteady and her throat was dry, and she was fairly certain she had not eaten anything since the previous afternoon. But she stood straight and addressed the woman with the same composed manner she had used in every difficult situation for the past 3 years. "Good morning," she said. "I wonder if I might trouble you for water and perhaps some bread. I'm traveling north, and my journey has been rather long." The woman looked at her for a moment, taking in the expensive cloak, the undone hair, the shadows under her eyes, and the particular quality of someone who is holding themselves together through sheer determination alone. "Come inside, then," the woman said, not unkindly. "You look like you need more than bread." Her name was Mrs. Weaver. She had a husband somewhere on the upper fields, and a daughter who had married a blacksmith in the next village, and 2 farmhands who slept above the barn and asked no questions. She gave Evelina bread and cold ham and a cup of strong tea, and did not ask a single thing about where she was going, or why she was traveling alone at dawn, with her hair falling down and her eyes carrying the particular weight of someone who had recently made a very large and irreversible decision. It was at Mrs. Weaver's kitchen table, eating bread and listening to the ordinary sounds of a farm waking up around her, that Evelina felt the first real wave of it. Not fear, not grief exactly, but something quieter and more devastating than either. The realization that she had no idea what came next. She had planned to leave. She had not fully planned the after. Gideon came in briefly to say that the rider on the main road had continued north without doubling back, which meant either Alistair had not seen them turn off, or he had seen them and chosen a different route to get ahead of them, which was a thought she did not particularly want to sit with. She needed to move again, and she needed to stop moving in a straight line. She asked Mrs. Weaver if there was a coaching inn within reasonable distance that was not on the main northern road. Mrs. Weaver thought about it. "There's the Harrow and Wheel," she said, "about 6 miles east, just past Corn Crossing, a quiet place. They don't get much passing trade from the main routes." "That will do," Evelina said. She thanked the woman genuinely, pressed 2 coins into her hand over the woman's mild protest, and went back out to the carriage. Gideon helped her in without comment. She settled against the seat as they pulled out of the farmyard and onto a narrow eastward lane. She was still running, But she was running smarter now, and somewhere behind her, Duke Alistair was still riding. The Harrow and Wheel was exactly the kind of place that did not want to be noticed, and that made it perfect. It sat at the end of a short, unpaved lane off the Cow Crossing, tucked behind a row of old elm trees that blocked it from easy view of the road. The sign above the door was faded to near illegibility. The yard was small and quiet, with 2 tired horses already hitched to a post and a tabby cat sleeping on top of a barrel near the entrance. Everything about the place was ordinary. Everything about it was overlooked. Evelina climbed down from the carriage and told Gideon to stable the horses and rest. He had been driving since before 4 in the morning, and his eyes were red at the edges, though he had not complained once. She pressed more coins into his hand than was strictly necessary, and he accepted them with a nod that carried more meaning than words would have. Inside, the inn smelled of wood smoke and old bread, and the particular damp warmth of a building that had been standing in wet countryside for a very long time. A young woman with a round face and a tight braid was wiping down the front counter and looked up when Evelina entered with the expression of someone who was mildly surprised but not unwelcoming. "I need a room," Evelina said. "Just for today. I may need it through the night as well." "Name?" the girl asked, reaching for a ledger. "Ashton," Evelina said without hesitating. "Miss Evelina Ashton." The girl wrote it down without looking up. "That'll be 1 shilling for the day. 2 if you're staying through supper." "Through supper," Evelina said. She was given a small room on the first floor with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the elm trees. The window latch was stiff, and the floorboard near the door creaked loudly when stepped on, but the lock was solid and the bed was clean, and that was all she needed. She set her trunk against the wall, sat on the edge of the bed, and pressed both palms flat against her knees. She was safe for now. She was safe. She allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of stillness, counting them out in her head, and then she stood up and began to think practically, because practical thinking was the only kind that was useful to her right now. She needed to decide where she was going, not just away from Dunor Hall, but towards something specific. She could not simply drift. A woman travelling alone without a clear destination was conspicuous in ways she could not afford. She needed a place, a real one, with people who would not immediately connect the name Evelina Ashton to the missing Duchess of Dunor. She had one option that she had been turning over in the back of her mind since the previous night. Her mother's younger sister, Aunt Beatrix Thorne, had moved north to the town of Harwich several years ago after her second husband passed. Beatrix Thorne was a small, fierce woman of 60, who kept a modest house, minded her own affairs aggressively, and had always regarded Evelina's marriage to a duke with a combination of pride and private suspicion. She had written twice in the past year, both times letters that were warm and full of ordinary news about her garden and her neighbours, and both times Evelina had written back with careful, cheerful replies that said nothing real. Beatrix did not know the truth of things inside Dunor Hall, but she was sharp enough that she had probably suspected something was not quite right, and more importantly, she was the kind of woman who would open her door without asking too many questions and deal with the questions later, quietly over tea. Harwich was 4 days' travel north by carriage. Evelina could do it in 3 if they moved steadily and did not lose time to bad roads. She pulled out the small writing set she had packed in the top of her trunk and sat at the narrow desk beneath the window. She wrote a short letter to Beatrix, not explaining everything, not yet, but enough. She is coming. She needs somewhere quiet to stay for a while. She hopes that is acceptable. She was well, but she needed to leave. She will explain more when she arrives. She sealed it, addressed it, and went back downstairs to find the innkeeper, a heavy-set man named Mr. Doyle, who appeared from a back room smelling of pipe smoke, and seemed surprised to have a guest requiring actual assistance. She asked if there was a way to send a letter north to Harwich with some urgency. Mr. Doyle scratched his jaw. "Post rider comes through tomorrow morning," he said. "Goes north. Could carry it for you." "Tomorrow morning is fine," she said. She handed him the letter along with a coin for the trouble and went back upstairs. She was halfway up the staircase when the front door of the inn opened behind her. She froze. Two men walked in, both in riding clothes, both dusty from the road. One was short and fair-haired, the other taller, with a dark beard and the kind of broad shoulders that suggested he was accustomed to physical work. Neither of them was Alistair. She could tell that from even this partial glance. She made herself continue up the stairs at a normal pace and did not look back. Inside her room, she locked the door and stood with her back against it for a moment, waiting for her heartbeat to settle. She was going to have to stop reacting to every sound and every door. At this rate, she would exhaust herself before she even reached Beatrix's house. She ate a small supper brought up to her room by the round-faced girl, whose name turned out to be Nettie, and who seemed constitutionally unable to deliver a meal without also delivering a small piece of local news along with it. What this evening's offering was, that the blacksmith in the next village had apparently shod a gentleman's horse that morning in a terrible hurry. A very fine horse it was, too. The gentleman had barely stopped long enough to pay before riding on north. And wasn't that interesting? Evelina kept her expression perfectly neutral. Quite interesting, she agreed. After Nettie left, she sat very still for a long moment. He was moving north. He had guessed north, which meant he either knew something or he was working from logic, because north was the direction most people fled when they were leaving this part of the county and had nowhere specific in mind. He did not know about Beatrix, she was almost certain of that, but in 3 years of marriage she had mentioned her aunt, perhaps twice, and never in any detail that would have lodged itself in Alistair's memory. But he was close, much closer than she had hoped. She made a decision. She would not wait for the post-rider in the morning. She would leave tonight well before dawn, and she would not go directly north. She would go northeast first, through Malfield, and then curve back toward the northern road, only after she had put more distance and more misdirection between herself and whoever Alistair had followed her trail. She went to bed without undressing, lying on top of the covers with her cloak still on, and her boots set close to hand, and she told herself she would sleep for 3 hours and then wake and go. She was asleep in under 2 minutes, which told her more about how tired she was than she had allowed herself to acknowledge. She woke, as she had intended, while it was still fully dark. The inn was quiet. She could hear nothing from the rooms on either side of her. She gathered her things quickly, tucked everything back into the trunk, and slipped out of her room with the careful deliberateness of someone who had spent years learning to move through a large house without making noise. The downstairs was empty. She left the correct coins on the counter for Mr. Doyle, along with a brief note of thanks, then slipped out through the side door into the yard. Gideon was already awake. She found him sitting on an upturned bucket outside the stable, eating something wrapped in cloth, and when he saw her appear out of the dark, he simply stood up and began hitching the horses without a word. She could have wept with gratitude. She did not. They were moving within 15 minutes, rolling out of the yard quietly and onto the lane. The horses' hooves were muffled somewhat by the soft earth of the unpaved track. The sky was absolutely black above the elm trees. The air had a sharp edge to it that cut through her cloak and reminded her that she was somewhere between spring and the last cold breath of winter, and that the nights in this part of the country could still be brutal. She wrapped the cloak tighter and kept her eyes on the darkness ahead. They had been moving for perhaps 40 minutes, pushing northeast as she had planned, when Gideon spoke down through the hatch with a voice that was carefully controlled. "My lady, there was a light on the road behind us, not hooves this time, a light. A lantern on horseback, or perhaps a second carriage." "How far?" she asked. "Far enough off," he said, "but it is moving the same direction we are." She looked through the rear window. She could see it, a single point of warm light bobbing gently in the black distance, following the curve of the road exactly as they were following it. It could be anyone, a farmer, a night traveler with entirely ordinary business. It did not have to be connected to her at all, she told herself firmly. And then she told Gideon to take the next available turn, regardless of where it led, and she settled back into the seat, gripped the edge of the cushion, and reminded herself that she had already come this far. She had already come this far, and she was not going back. What she didn't know, sitting in that dark carriage on that narrow northeastern road, was that Alistair Dunor had not sent someone after her. He had come himself, and he had brought with him 2 men she didn't know, and 1 man she did. Julian Sterling, his oldest friend, and the one person in the Duke's circle who had always looked at Evelina with something that resembled genuine human concern. Julian had tried to talk Alistair out of this pursuit. She would learn that later. He had argued, apparently with some heat, that if the Duchess had left of her own free will, then perhaps that was a choice that deserved to be respected. Alistair had looked at him with an expression Julian would later describe as the one he made when he had already decided something, and the rest of the conversation was simply noise. And then he had ridden out. Julian had followed, because Julian always followed Alistair into the things he shouldn't be doing, on the private theory that someone with sense ought to be present when it all went wrong. The second man was Alistair's head groom, Garrett, a lean, weathered man of 50, who could track a carriage wheel across dry stone if he had to, and who regarded this entire situation with the blank professional focus of someone being paid to do a job and not being paid to have opinions about it. The third was a younger man named Fletcher, recently hired as a footman, but built more like a boxer, whom Alistair had brought along for reasons that Julian found somewhat alarming and chose not to examine too carefully. 4 men on horseback, moving through the dark, following a woman who had done nothing wrong except refuse to be quietly erased, and Alistair Dunor riding at the front of this small, grim procession, with his jaw set and his eyes fixed on the road ahead, was telling himself something that was not entirely honest. He was telling himself that he was bringing her back because it was the proper thing to do, because a duchess disappearing from her husband's house was a scandal that would damage the family name and create difficulties he could not afford, because there were practical reasons, social reasons, legal reasons why she needed to come back. He was telling himself all of this with great conviction. He was not examining, not yet, the fact that he had been awake for 20 straight hours, that he had ridden out himself instead of simply sending Garrett, that when Mrs. Holton had brought him the wedding ring from the windowsill and placed it in his hand without a word, he had stood holding it for a long time, in a way that had nothing to do with practicality or scandal or the family name. Julian Sterling, riding just behind him, watched his old friends back in the darkness and said nothing. He had known Alistair Dunor for 20 years. He had seen him negotiate land deals with the cold precision of a man who felt nothing. He had seen him chair difficult meetings and dismiss difficult people and move through difficult situations without any apparent emotional cost. He had never seen him ride through the night for anything. Julian kept his thoughts to himself and rode on. The northeastern road narrowed steadily as dawn began to press against the edges of the sky, and Evelina watched the light come up with the exhausted relief of someone who had spent the dark hours counting every sound. Gideon had taken 3 turns since she had spotted the lantern behind them, pulling off the main track twice and waiting in silence among trees until the distant light had passed or disappeared, then doubling back with the careful patience of a man who understood that getting this right mattered more than getting there quickly. By the time genuine daylight arrived, pale and watery through a covering of thin cloud, Evelina was fairly certain they had lost anyone who might have been following them. She was also completely uncertain of where exactly they were, but Gideon climbed down to check the horses, and she climbed out to stand on the road and look around. They were in a shallow valley, fields on both sides just beginning to show green, a cluster of farm buildings visible about half a mile to the west, and a church spire rising somewhere further east. The road they were on was barely wider than the carriage itself. It had the look of something used mainly by local farmers who knew where it went and assumed no one else needed to. "Do you know this area?" she asked Gideon. "Roughly," he said, checking the near horse's shoe with practiced hands. "I think we are somewhere between Malfield and the Linton Road. There should be a village called Dunstan Cross not far east. Small place, but it sits on a proper road that runs north." Dunstan Cross. She did not know it, which was probably good. "How are the horses?" she asked. "Tired," he said honestly. "They need water and a few hours' rest at minimum." She nodded. "Then we find Dunstan Cross, and we rest there." They found it in under an hour, a small stone village arranged around a market square that was just beginning to fill with the unhurried activity of a Thursday morning. A woman selling eggs, a boy leading a goat on a rope, and two old men on a bench outside the small post office who watched the carriage arrive with the mild interest of people whose entertainment options were limited. There was no inn as such, but there was a woman named Mrs. Tabitha Marsh, who kept a respectable boarding house on the north side of the square, and who rented 2 rooms to travellers when the occasion arose. Nettie at the Harrow and Wheel had been chatty. Mrs. Marsh was the opposite. While she was a brisk, narrow woman of about 50, with quick eyes and an efficient manner, she showed Evelina to a clean room, told her the horses could be stabled in her nephew's yard 2 doors down, and asked no questions whatsoever beyond whether she took sugar in her tea. Evelina could have kissed her. She slept for 4 hours, real sleep this time. Not the light, uneasy half-rest of the previous night, but something deeper, pulled down into it by pure physical exhaustion. When she woke, the light through the window had shifted to midday, and she lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds of the village outside before remembering everything and sitting up. The room was undisturbed. The trunk was where she had left it, and the door was still locked. She breathed out slowly and got up. Downstairs she found that Mrs. Marsh had left a covered plate on the kitchen table without being asked, cold chicken, bread, and a small pot of mustard, and there was tea still warm in the pot. Also at the kitchen table, which surprised her slightly, was a young woman she had not seen before, perhaps 19 or 20, with copper-red hair pinned up imperfectly, an ink stain on her left hand, and the look of someone who was either very tired or very worried, or possibly both. The young woman looked up when Evelina came in. "Oh," she said, "you must be the traveller." "I am, Adelaide. Mrs. Marsh is my great-aunt. I am staying here for a few weeks." She paused. "I am not normally this pale. I have had a difficult month." "I am Evelina," she said, sitting down across from her and reaching for the teapot. "I have also had a difficult month." Adelaide looked at her with the directness of someone who was too tired to bother being indirect. "Are you running from something?" Evelina looked back at her with the same quality of tired directness. "Are you?" Adelaide considered this for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Then we understand each other," Evelina said, and poured her tea. Adelaide Finch, as it turned out, was the daughter of a minor landowner in the south, who had recently discovered that the man she was engaged to marry had debts so catastrophic that her father's entire estate was effectively being offered up as collateral for them, with or without her consent. Her father was not a villain exactly, just a frightened man who had run out of better ideas. Adelaide had disagreed with this solution strongly enough to pack a bag and appear on her great-aunt's doorstep, which Mrs. Marsh had accepted with the same brisk equanimity she appeared to apply to everything. Adelaide told all of this in a flat, matter-of-fact way that suggested she had processed most of the emotion already and was now in the practical stage. Evelina listened without interrupting. When Adelaide finished, she looked at Evelina expectantly. Evelina gave her the simplest version. Married to a duke, husband had a pregnant mistress, and the mistress had been installed in the house. She had left before she could be formally pushed out, which she had known was coming. Adelaide's eyes went wide. "A duke," she said. "And he let you just leave?" "He did not know I was leaving until I was already gone," Evelina said, "and I am not entirely sure he has stopped trying to find me." Adelaide absorbed this. Then she said with a practicality that Evelina found immediately admirable, "Then you should not stay here more than a day. If someone is looking for you, they will ask at inns and boarding houses along the northern routes, and eventually someone will remember a well-dressed woman travelling alone." "I know," Evelina said. "I am leaving tomorrow morning." "Where are you going?" "North to my aunt's house in Hawick." Adelaide nodded slowly. Then she said, "My great-aunt has a cousin in a town called Brentfield that is roughly on the way to Hawick. She might write you a letter of introduction. People ask fewer questions about a woman who arrives with a letter." Evelina set down her teacup and looked at this young red-haired woman with the ink-stained hand and the exhausted eyes, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time inside her marriage. The simple, uncomplicated warmth of being helped by someone who had no reason to help her and was doing it anyway. "Thank you," she said, and meant it completely. Mrs. Marsh agreed to write the letter with the same unquestioning efficiency she brought to everything else. Evelina spent the rest of the afternoon in her room, writing out careful notes about the route north, calculating the money she had left, and thinking through what she would say to Beatrix when she arrived. She would need to be honest, not completely, not all at once, but honest enough, though Beatrix was too sharp to be managed, and too kind to need managing. Early in the evening, just as she was considering going downstairs for supper, she heard it. Horses, more than one, moving through the village square at a pace that was not casual. She went to the window and looked out from the side, keeping herself back from the glass. 4 riders were crossing the square below, slowing as they entered it, looking around with the alert, scanning manner of people who were searching for something specific. She recognized the dark horse immediately. She would have known that horse anywhere. She had watched Alistair ride it across his own fields 100 times. Her hand pressed flat against the wall beside the window. He was here. He had found Dunstan Cross. She did not know how. Perhaps someone on the road had seen the carriage turn east, and perhaps Garrett, whoever he was tracking with, had found the wheel marks. It did not matter how. What mattered was that he was in the square below, and she was standing 20 feet above him in a borrowed room in a village she had arrived at by accident. She watched him rein the horse to a stop and speak to one of the men beside him. She could not hear the words, but she could see the quality of his focus, the way he was looking at the buildings around the square with the systematic attention of a man who was going to check every one of them. She stepped back from the window. She needed to move right now before he started knocking on doors. She grabbed her trunk, her cloak, and the small bag with her coins, and went into the corridor. She went to the back staircase that Mrs. Marsh had shown her earlier, the narrow one used by the household, and came down into the back kitchen. A young kitchen girl named Bess was standing at the stove and looked startled. "Is there a way out through the back?" Evelina asked her quietly. Bess stared. Then she pointed at a door on the far side of the kitchen that led into a small walled garden. "And beyond the garden wall?" Evelina asked. "The lane," Bess said, "goes down to the stable yard." "Thomas!" "Gideon, the carriage was at the stable yard." "Thank you," Evelina said and moved. She crossed the garden quickly, found the gate in the wall, came out into the lane, and followed it down to the yard where Gideon was sitting, just outside the stable door, with his arms folded and his eyes closed. He opened them when he heard her coming, and read her face in an instant. He was on his feet before she reached him. "Now?" he said. "Now," she said. He had the horses hitched in 8 minutes, which she suspected was some kind of record. She climbed into the carriage, and he drove them out of the yard through the back lane, which curved around behind a row of cottages, and came out on the north side of the village, well away from the main square. As they cleared the last cottage and hit the open road, Evelina looked back. She could not see the square from here. She could not see the riders. She could not see Alistair. But she could feel him. The way you feel a storm that has not yet reached you, but is already changing the quality of the air around you. Present, inevitable, coming. She faced forward and pressed her hands together in her lap, and thought about Beatrix's house in Hawick, with its small garden, its ordinary furniture, and its complete absence of dukes. She used that image like a lantern in the dark, something to move toward, something to keep her eyes fixed on while everything else shifted, threatened, and pressed in close around her. The road north opened up ahead of them, long and pale in the afternoon light, and the carriage rolled on. The road to Brentfield was longer than the map suggested, and rougher than the season had any right to produce, and by the time the carriage rolled into the town's main street, the afternoon light was already beginning to flatten into the golden grey of early evening. Evelina had spent most of the journey in a state of careful internal stillness that she had developed over years of difficult dinners and difficult silences inside Dunor Hall. It was not peaceful exactly. It was the deliberate quieting of everything that wanted to panic, so that the part of her that could think remained functional. She had practiced it so many times but she could now hold it for hours at a stretch, sitting upright, hands folded, breathing slowly, while underneath it her mind worked through problems with a focused, quiet energy that no one looking at her would have suspected. She was thinking about Alistair, not about the pain of what he had done. She had put that somewhere sealed for now, but about the mechanics of how he was tracking her. He had found Dunstan Cross. That was not luck. That was either very good information or very good tracking, and she suspected it was the latter, because Garrett, the groom Gideon had mentioned when she asked him about the riders in the square, had a reputation across the county for being able to follow almost anything across almost any terrain. Alistair had brought him deliberately. That told her something about the seriousness of this pursuit that she had been trying not to fully accept. He was not coming after her out of wounded pride alone. A wounded pride sent a letter. Wounded pride sent a solicitor. Wounded pride did not put 4 men on horseback and ride through the night personally. She did not know what to do with that yet, so she set it aside and thought about practical things instead. Brentfield was a proper market town, larger than Dunstan Cross, with a coaching inn on the main street and a population large enough that a single woman arriving by carriage would not automatically become the subject of collective attention. Adelaide Finch's letter of introduction was addressed to a woman named Mrs. Martha Sybil, who kept a draper shop on the east side of town, and apparently rented the 2 rooms above it to respectable travellers on occasion. Gideon found the shop without much difficulty. It had a neat painted sign above the door, and a window display of folded fabrics in warm autumn colours. A bell rang when Evelina pushed open the door, and a woman emerged from behind a curtain at the back with a pincushion strapped to her wrist, a measuring tape around her neck, and the focused expression of someone interrupted mid-task. Martha Sybil was perhaps 55, solidly built, with silver-streaked hair pinned firmly back and eyes that were warm but not soft. She read the letter with the attention of someone who read carefully as a matter of principle, then looked up at Evelina with a frank, assessing gaze that Evelina met steadily. "You need the rooms," Mrs. Sybil said. It was not quite a question. "Just for tonight," Evelina said. "I am continuing north tomorrow." Mrs. Sybil nodded once. It was as though something had been confirmed rather than decided. "The rooms are clean. Supper is at 7. Breakfast at 6 if you are leaving early." She paused. "The rooms are at the back of the building. There is no view of the street from them." The way she said it, with a small deliberate emphasis that she did not explain, told Evelina that Mrs. Marsh had included more in that letter than a simple introduction. "That suits me very well," Evelina said. She was shown upstairs by a young assistant from the shop, a thin girl named Agnes, who had the quality of someone who heard everything and repeated nothing, which Evelina decided to take as a good sign. The rooms were indeed at the back, looking out over a small courtyard and the rear walls of the buildings behind, quiet and invisible from the main street. Exactly what she needed. She washed her face and hands in the basin on the dresser and looked at herself in the small mirror above it. She looked tired. That was the most honest assessment. Not broken, not undone, but tired in the deep way that comes, not just from lack of sleep, but from sustained effort over a long time. She had been carrying the weight of her marriage alone for 3 years, managing every difficulty with a smooth surface that showed nothing. And that kind of invisible effort accumulated in a person the way small debts accumulate, quietly, and then all at once. She straightened up, pinned her hair back properly for the first time since she had left Dunor Hall, and went down to supper. The supper table was in a small dining room behind the shop, and it was occupied, to Evelina's mild surprise, by 3 other people besides herself and Mrs. Sybil. There was a clergyman named Reverend Holt, no relation to her aunt, who was travelling south to take up a new parish, and who seemed entirely absorbed in a private theological anxiety that he was not sharing with the table, but which expressed itself in small sighs between mouthfuls. There was a sharp-faced merchant named Mr. Garvey, who sold cloth, and who had an opinion on everything and the confidence to share all of them without invitation. And there was a quiet older woman named Mrs. Beatrice Lorne, who sat at the far end of the table and ate with the concentrated attention of someone for whom a good meal was a serious and pleasurable matter. Evelina positioned herself between Mrs. Lorne and Reverend Holt, and engaged just enough in the conversation to appear normal without drawing any particular focus to herself. She let Mr. Garvey dominate the talking, which he did naturally and enthusiastically, and she asked Mrs. Lorne a few questions about her journey, and listened to Reverend Holt's sighs with the politely sympathetic expression she had perfected over years of formal dinners. Nobody asked her anything significant. Nobody looked at her with recognition or suspicion. She was simply a woman passing through, unremarkable in the best possible way. After supper, she excused herself early, saying she needed rest before an early departure, and went upstairs. She was halfway through reviewing her route notes when she heard a commotion from the direction of the main street. Not loud exactly, but present. Voices. The particular quality of several people talking at once in the way that happens when something has caught public attention. Though she went to the window out of instinct, she remembered it faced the back and stopped herself. She waited. Agnes knocked on her door 5 minutes later, looking faintly excited in the way of someone who had interesting news and had selected her as the recipient. "There are riders asking questions on the main street," Agnes said, keeping her voice low with the instinctive discretion of someone who had been trained by a careful employer. "4 of them, very fine horses. One of them is very tall, dark-haired, asking whether anyone has seen a carriage come through." Evelina's whole body went completely still for one moment. Then she nodded calmly. "Thank you, Agnes," she said. Agnes hesitated. "Mrs. Sybil says to tell you that she told them no carriage had stopped here today, and that she knew nothing about any lone woman traveler." Something moved through Evelina's chest. Gratitude so sharp it was almost painful. "Please tell Mrs. Sybil I'm very grateful," she said. Agnes nodded and disappeared. Evelina sat back down on the edge of the bed, and pressed her hands together, and tried to think without the panic that was now pushing hard against the careful stillness she had been maintaining all day. He had found Brentfield. She had been here less than 3 hours, and he had already found the town, which meant he was not following her trail with the slow, methodical patience she had hoped for. He was moving fast, covering ground aggressively, and he either had information or instinct that was leading him to the right places at an uncomfortably reliable rate. She thought about what Adelaide had said back in Dunstan Cross, that a woman travelling alone would eventually be remembered by someone. She had been careful. She had used her maiden name everywhere. She had avoided the busiest inns. But careful was not invisible, and eventually, even careful left a thread for someone determined enough to pull. She needed to change something fundamental about how she was moving. She thought for a long time, sitting in the quiet back room with the sounds of the street muffled behind the building, and then she made a decision that felt risky but logical. She was not going to Harwich directly, not yet. She was going to disappear more completely first. She went back downstairs and found Mrs. Sybil in the small office behind the shop, doing accounts with the focused efficiency of a woman who regarded numbers as a form of moral order. "Mrs. Sybil," she said, "I wonder if I might ask you something rather unusual." Mrs. Sybil put down her pen and looked at her with full attention. "The man looking for me," Evelina said, deciding that a simplified version of the truth was less dangerous than a lie she might not be able to maintain. "He is my husband. I have left him. I do not wish to be found." Mrs. Sybil held her gaze steadily for a moment. "Is he a violent man?" "No," Evelina said honestly. "But he is a powerful one, and he is accustomed to getting what he wants." Mrs. Sybil was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My sister lives in a village called Tenwick, 15 miles northeast of here, well off any main road. She takes in sewing work and has a spare room. She is a woman who minds her own business as a matter of deep personal conviction." Evelina looked at her. "You would send me to your sister?" "I would write to her tonight," Mrs. Sybil said. "You could leave at first light tomorrow and be there before midday. If you stay a few days, let things settle. Whoever is looking for you might conclude you went a different direction entirely." It was a good plan. It was a better plan than anything Evelina had come up with herself in the past 10 minutes. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Mrs. Sybil picked up her pen again. Because I was 26 once, she said, and I did not have anyone to help me, and I have always thought that was a great pity. She dipped the pen. I will have the letter ready by morning. Evelina went back upstairs and packed everything back into her trunk and set it by the door. She lay down on the bed, fully dressed again, boots by her hand again, and stared at the ceiling. She thought about Dunor Hall, about the east parlour where she had seen that letter corner, about Thief. Bedroom she had shared with Alistair in the first year of their marriage before the distance between them had grown so habitual that it became the architecture of their life together. She thought about the way he had looked at her in those early months, not with love exactly, there's had never been a love match in the way the novels described, but with something, attention, interest, the sense that she was a person he found worth looking at. She did not know when that had stopped. She had not noticed it stopping, which was perhaps the most honest indictment of their marriage she could offer. The absence had been so gradual that she had adjusted to each small degree of it without registering that anything was being lost until Clara Vane, until the letter, until the night she had stood in the hallway of her own home, feeling like a guest who had outstayed her welcome in someone else's house. She pressed the thought down and made herself breathe slowly. In the morning, she told herself, in the morning she would move again, and that movement would be it always was, just enough to keep the larger feelings from settling into something she could manage. Outside on the main street, the four riders had taken rooms at the coaching inn. Julian Sterling sat in the tap-room with a glass of something he was not really drinking and watched Alistair stand at the window, looking out at the dark street with an expression that Julian was finding increasingly difficult to categorize. She was here, Alistair said, not to Julian specifically, but more to the air in front of him. We don't know that, Julian said carefully. The draper's woman was lying, Alistair said. I could see it. Julian did not argue with this, because he thought Alistair was probably right, and arguing with him, when he was right, was a particular kind of futile. He tried a different approach. And if if Evelina was here and chose to have someone lie for her, what does that tell you? Alistair turned from the window. In the warm light of the tap-room, he looked exhausted, though he would not have admitted it. He looked like a man who had ridden very far on something that he had not yet named honestly even to himself. It tells me she's more afraid than I realized, he said. Or more determined, Julian said quietly, looked at Evelina with gentle, direct eyes and said, You look like you have not properly stopped moving in several days. I have not, Evelina said. Then you will stop now, Olive said, as though it was simply a matter of deciding. Come in. There were two other people in the cottage when Evelina arrived. One was a girl of about 14, named Polly, who helped Olive with the heavier household work, and Hole had the cheerful, incurious energy of someone who found people interesting without needing to know their business. The other was a man named Silas Marsh, Olive's son, who appeared from the small workshop attached to the side of the cottage where he made and repaired furniture. He was a large, quiet young man of about 25, with sawdust on his forearms and a handshake that was very gentle for a man his size. Silas looked at Evelina's carriage and at Gideon and said without being asked, "I can put the carrier G in the back. There is a track behind the workshop. It would not be visible from the lane." Evelina looked at him. "Has your mother explained my situation?" Silas did not stop working. "Those are different things," he said. "Yes," she said. "They are." "Which one frightens you more?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "The second one," she said, "because if it is only about control, then there is nothing to hope for. And if there is nothing to hope for, then I need to be completely clear about that and stop wasting any part of myself wondering." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And if it is the first one?" Evelina did not answer that. She was not ready to answer it. On the third day, something happened that changed everything. Gideon came to find her in the kitchen garden just before noon, with a face that was carefully controlled, led in the way she had come to recognize as his version of alarm. "There is a man in the village," he said quietly, "asking at the post office, asking whether anyone has seen a private carriage in the last few days. Lean man, older, rides like he does it for a living. Garrett." He had found Tenwick, or rather, he had found enough of a thread to bring him to Tenwick, and he was now pulling it. Evelina pressed both hands flat against the garden wall and thought very fast. The carriage was hidden. Gideon's face was not known to anyone in Alistair's circle except as a driver, and drivers were Larg. Eli invisible to the kind of men Alistair surrounded himself with. If Garrett was only asking about a carriage, he might not yet connect this particular village to her specifically. But he was here, which meant Alistair was either here too, or close enough that it made no difference. Behind her, somewhere on the road south of Tenwick, Alistair Denore rode with his jaw set and his eyes fixed ahead, and a feeling in his chest that he was still refusing to name correctly. Julian Sterling rode beside him in silence for a long time before saying quietly, "Garrett thinks she went west out of Tenwick." "I know," Alistair said. "West curves north eventually," Julian said. "If she stays on the western road, she will hit the northern route about 20 miles below Harwick." Alistair looked at him. "Do you have family in Harwick?" Julian asked carefully. "No," Alistair said. "Does she?" A pause followed, long enough that Julian knew the answer before Alistair gave it. "An aunt," Alistair said. "Beatrix Thorne." He said it slowly. "The way you say something you have just remembered and cannot believe you forgot. She mentioned her a long time ago." Julian said nothing. He waited. "She's going to her aunt," Alistair said. "Yes," Julian said. "I think she probably is." Alistair rode on in silence for a moment. Then he said something that Julian had not expected and would think about for a long time afterward. "She planned this," he said, not with anger, but with something much closer to genuine wondering. "She planned all of it. Where to go, how to move, who to trust. She did all of this alone, and she did it well." Julian looked at his friend carefully. "Yes," he said, "she did." Alistair was quiet again, and Julian, watching him, thought that something was shifting. Something in the way Alistair held himself on the horse, in the quality of his silence, and in the particular look that had replaced the grim, relentless focus of the past several days. He did not know what to call it either, but it did not look like a man who simply wanted to retrieve something that belonged to him. It looked like a man beginning to understand what he had lost, and the distinction, Julian thought, mattered enormously. The northern road opened wide as the last afternoon light stretched thin across the sky, and Evelina felt something loosen in her chest when Harwick finally appeared on the horizon. Chimney smoke first, then rooftops, then the comfortable shape of a town that had never wanted to be more than what it was. Ordinary, quiet, safe. Beatrix Thorne's house sat on Wren Lane, one road behind the market square, a narrow stone cottage with a fading red door and a rosebush cut back for winter that had not yet fully returned. Evelina walked up the short path and knocked before she could think too hard about it. The door opened almost immediately. Beatrix looked at her, the way only someone who has been quietly worried about you for a long time can look. White hair pinned up with too many pins, reading spectacles pushed onto her forehead, yet an apron still tied at her waist. She took in Evelina's travelling cloak, undone hair, and 5 days of road written plainly across her face, and did not make a single dramatic thing of of it. She simply stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "I kept supper." The cottage was warm, low-ceilinged, and full of real life. Books that had actually been read, a sewing basket with work still in it, a small fire, and 2 cats on the hearthrug who assessed Evelina Briard eagerly and found her acceptable. They ate together at the kitchen table, and Evelina told her everything. Not the careful, edited version she had been rehearsing during the journey, but the real one. The L. As she had seen, the 3 years of managed silence, the morning she had left, the ring on the whin. Dowsill, the dark carriage ride, the riders behind her, and the help from Adelaide, Mrs. Head, Martha Sybil, Olive, and Silas Marsh. Beatrix listened without interrupting once. When Evelina finished, the fire had burned lower, and both cats had relocated to the chairs. "What do you want?" Beatrix asked. Not gently, directly. Not what you were afraid of. "What do you want?" Evelina sat with the question honestly. "I want something that is mine," she said. "I want to wake up and know the day belongs to me. I want to stop performing contentment for people who never actually cared whether I was content. I want to find out who I am when nobody needs me to be useful or decorative or quietly invisible." Beatrix nodded once. "Then that is what we build," she said. "Starting tomorrow. But tonight, you sleep." Evelina slept in the spare room that smelled of dried lavender and old wood. She did not dream, not wake, and did not listen for hooves on roads outside. She was still at breakfast the following morning when the knock came at the front door. She heard the voice before she saw him, low, measured, and choosing every word with unusual care. She set her cup down and walked to the kitchen doorway. Alistair Dunor stood inside the front hall in his riding clothes, with his hat in his hands and high eyes already finding her down the length of the narrow corridor before she had fully appeared. Beatrix stood between them with the expression of a woman who had made a rapid and comprehensive assessment of the situation. She looked at Evelina. Evelina gave a small nod. Beatrix looked at Alistair with the frank gaze of a woman entirely unmoved by titles. "Sitting room," she said. 10 minutes. They stood on opposite sides of the small room. The fire was banked low. Morning light came through the window between them. There was no distance available in a room this size, which was perhaps the point. "Evelina," he said. "No," she said. "I speak first." He closed his mouth and waited. "I spent 3 years being exactly what that marriage needed," she said. "Never late, never loud, never inconvenient. I held up my end carefully and completely, and then I found that letter and understood that none of it had mattered, because you had made a different choice without telling me." She looked at him steadily. "I didn't leave because I hated you. I left because I still had enough of myself left to know I deserved better. And I was afraid that if I stayed longer, I would lose even that. He did not look away. His jaw was tight, but he held her gaze. I know, he said. She had prepared for a defense, for justifications, for the fluent rationalization of powerful men. Oh, I've been cornered. She had not prepared for those two words. I rode for 5 days, he said, through the night twice. I told myself it was about duty and appearances, and everything a man in my position tells himself. He cannot yet be honest about his reasons. Something shifted in his face. It was none of those things. Then what was it? The woman at the draper's in Brentfield, he said. She lied to my face to protect you. She had known you for 3 hours, and she was willing to stand between you and a duke. He paused. I thought, what kind of person earns that? And I knew the answer. I had always known, and I had stopped paying attention. The fire settled quietly between them. I'm not asking you to come back, he said, and the words clearly cost him something genuine. I do not have that right. What I did was a betrayal of everything I undertook when I married you, and I will not pretend other. Wise. I came because you deserve to hear that, said plainly, by the person who owed you the saying of it. Evelina looked at him across the small, ordinary room, and thought about the ring on the window-sill. The dark road, Adelaide's ink-stained hand, Silas Marsh riding silently ahead through the western La. And Beatrix opening the door without drama. Clara Vane, she said, because it had to be. Proper arrangements are being made, he said quietly. For her and for the child. They did not choose this either. She nodded. That was the honest answer. I'm not coming back, she said. Not yet. Not until I know who I am outside of that role. I need time that belongs to me. She held his gaze. But I am not saying never. I am saying not yet. And if there is ever anything between us again, it will be different from what it was, or it will be. Nothing at all. Different, he said, as though committing to the word rather than repeating it. The door opened. Beatrix entered with the tea tray, set it down, and sat in her own chair by the fire, without any apology for returning to her own sitting room. Julian Sterling appeared in the doorway a moment later, having apparently been left on the front stent the entire time, and looked at the scene before him with carefully neutral relief. There is room for one more cup, Beatrix said without looking up. Julian sat down immediately. The fire burned. The tea was poured. The morning light lay in a long, warm stripe across the hearthrug, where one cat had settled with Gary at contentment. Evelina wrapped both hands around her cup, looked at the fire, and felt the particular quality of a moment that is neither an ending nor a beginning, but the quiet space between, where one thing has finished, and another has not yet found its shape. Alistair would ride back to Dunor Hall. He would face what he had made and broken in the ways that were his alone to face. Julian would ride with him, as Julian always did, perhaps this time with a lighter heart. Garrett and Fletcher would follow, because that was their purpose. And Evelina would stay in Harwich. She would sit with Beatrix in the evenings. She would learn the names of every neighbour on Wren Lane. She would write real letters and receive real ones. She would grow slowly back into the full shape of herself, the way something grows back after being cut deeply, reaching toward light without being certain yet exactly where the light would come from. Perhaps one day she would write something more than, "Not yet." But that was not today. Today she drank her tea in the warm morning of her aunt's cottage, and let herself simply be somewhere. She had chosen, somewhere that belonged to her, somewhere she had found entirely on her own. And for the first time in 3 years, that was more than enough.